Wait till I hear the. There we go. I heard it. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited and happy to be here. So today I'm going to be talking basically about the foundations of my research. So if you were to take the theoretical part of my thesis dissertation, that's basically what this talk is about. But I've tried to add in some good evidence into it and show you guys kind of the progression of the history of both geoscience communication and science communication. So I'm incredibly grateful to be speaking to you guys today from the traditional and the unceded territory of the Ktunaxa, the Kinbasket, the Syilx, and the Sinixt peoples, also known as Cranbrook in British Columbia, Canada. So first and foremost, before we even get started, I want to put out a disclaimer that I'm still not an expert on this. I'll tell you guys a little bit about how I got here, but truthfully, I've only been researching this area for 2 years now. So I'm still learning a ton every day, and there are so many people who have come before me who have done a lot of research and practice in this area and who have incredible understandings of these things. So if anything I say, you have a different understanding of it, please reach out. I love hearing how other people take things. So yeah, and also throughout the talk, science communication, since it's really based in social science research, we don't have a lot of like fun photos. Like geology is great because, like someone's background here was a thin section of something. Those are all nice photos to have in presentations. Social science doesn't have that quite as much. So I use a lot of symbols and icons. Hopefully it doesn't get too overwhelming, but yeah. So let's get started. So, oh, sorry. That startled me. So first I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about my story on how I got here. So really my story kind of starts back in grade 11, which I've heard is a pretty common thing from a lot of people who are in geoscience now. So I was lucky enough to go to a school that had an Earth Science 11 and Geology 12 class. And I had a teacher, Mr. Milross, who is in my photos there. And he was the one who really inspired me and got me interested in the area of geosciences. And reflecting back on it now, I've really started to realize that he was using, whether he knew it or not, he was using all of these science communication tactics or ways of approaching a topic that made it a lot more interesting. So for example, he used humor a ton, and hands-on activities was his big thing, which made it really engaging for me. So you could often find me sitting on the side of riverbanks looking at pebbles, which most people have done. So that was kind of where my story started. So grade 12, then after that I went to university, the University of Saskatchewan, and I did my undergraduate degree in geosciences there. And at my school, I'm not sure if it's called the same thing at schools in the United States, but we have these undergraduate honors species, they call them. Basically, it's like a miniature master's. It's something that you do over 1 term or 2 terms, or like a full year, and you're doing research. So I actually ended up doing 2 of these, one on pegmatites and one on uranium. And I found that I just loved the research side of things. And my research also involved fieldwork components. So I got a taste of that side of things as well. And I really, really loved it. But during my undergraduate time, I also got to take part in something, hopefully you guys can see my cursor here, called the Science Ambassador Program. And this is a program at the university where they send 2 undergraduate students out to an Indigenous community in northern Saskatchewan, and you basically do fun science with them for like a month. And it was incredible because they kept it very open. So I was allowed to take all of my knowledge of geoscience and do really fun land-based hands-on activities with these students. And it was just an absolute highlight of a lifetime for me. So then also during my undergraduate time, I was doing field work, like working for companies, mineral exploration companies in the summers. And I did like it, but there were some things that were missing for me there. And this was actually the summer after I had graduated from my undergrad, where I went traveling. And I always found that, again, I was incorporating geoscience into my travels. So in this case, this is in Guatemala. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Volcan de Fuego, but we got to hike it and literally watch it blow up in front of our eyes, which I have a quick video of, which I'll share. Hopefully it's not too loud. Oh, there we go. So it's not the best quality video, but you can understand we were in a little bit of shock when it first happened. And yeah, that was probably the top moment of my entire existence. But at that point, it was really clear to me that I loved geoscience, but there was still something with, going down the route of mineral industry that wasn't quite sitting well with me. So basically, I just delayed my decision a little bit longer and decided to do a master's. So I went back to school for that, and I did my master's on a gold project, which again was really interesting. I loved the research side of things. But during that time, I also started an outreach program at the university because I realized we were getting a lot of classes that were asking if we'd be able to come in and talk to them about this stuff. And really, there was no program like that set up. So I took on starting that, and that was just an incredible time in my life. It was about a 2-year chunk of time that I did that. We had kids coming in from all over Saskatoon where they'd come in and do hands-on activities. We had student volunteers in the department showing our museum, doing these activities with them, and it was just really, really fun. And then after that, one of the reasons why I always recommend students to go to more and more conferences is this is truly where I wouldn't have ended up where I am today if I didn't go to this conference and talk to the people that I talked to. So I went to PDAC, which is a big conference here in Canada, and there's an organization called Mining Matters. That's a mineral education organization that runs events at this conference every year. I volunteered with them. I met the director and some other employees with them, and they introduced me to my current supervisor, Eileen Vanderfleer-Keller. And that was when I made the decision to go down this route of geoscience communication. And sorry, that was a very long story, but I get more and more students asking me about how I got to where I am today. So that's kind of my journey to where I currently am. Okay, so now moving on to what we're actually talking about today. So first of all, sometimes people don't exactly know what geoscience communication is, so I like to describe that first. There's lots of different definitions out there on what geoscience communication is. I like to keep it really general and just say that it's the communication of geoscience to non-specialist audiences, so people who don't already know something or a lot about geoscience. So it might be helpful to kind of think about it in terms of the 5 W's. So when we talk about who is involved with this, I like to think of it as who listens and who talks, or who are our target audiences and who are the people who are doing that talking, or what we call practitioners. So audiences can be as specific or as general as you want. I like to think of it in terms of like general publics. Maybe we want to talk about use, educators, that's a big one in geoscience communication, tourists, disadvantaged groups, things like that. And in terms of who talks, That can be informal educators, that can be mining industry professionals or any industry professionals, academics. There's a lot of geoscientists, professors out there who will communicate, community engagement officers. Really, these are just a few examples of what are actually a ton of different people involved. Where does it happen? Again, it can be things like museums, it can be at schools, it can be at communities, it can happen online, especially nowadays with social media. There's all these different avenues to communicate through there. It can happen at parks. I know the United States is really good at having geoscientists in parks, which we here in Canada are very, very jealous of. And then in terms of how it happens, there's so many ways that it can happen. Hands-on activities is a big one, but there can be tours, again, social media, sometimes there can be guest lectures. Citizen science is something that I'll talk about a little bit more about in a bit. And then in terms of why geoscience is communicated, again, it can be for varied reasons, but two of these should really stick out to you. The increasing geoliteracy has become such a big one, especially I've noticed, like, even in the last couple of years from the mining industry, there's been a lot of calls for increasing public geoliteracy. And then the other one is recruitment. So that's recruitment for jobs, but also a very timely discussion on recruitment of students, undergraduate students or high school students going into undergraduate geoscience degrees. Which we know has been a big problem really across the world. But there can also be, things just like genuine interest. That was my big thing for why I got into it in the first place. It was just a genuine love of, sharing our stories. But yeah, again, there can be many varied reasons for why we do this. So now I'm going to attempt to give a bit of a geoscience communication history, which I don't really think has been done before, and I'm probably not going to do it justice, but I'm going to try. So as I kind of go through this, some of these are going to be more practical perspectives, and some are going to be more theoretical or like based on actual research findings. So where we first start is back in like the 1950s, where there was, in the literature, it was referred to as popular geology, which makes sense because in science communication, it was first called popular science. So really, in this original report from 1951, Montgomery blamed basically the increased specialization of the earth sciences as the cause for decreased public interest. And then with that, he had calls for improved teacher training and public outreach, which are things that honestly we still see today. And then going on into the 60s, I did find some reports that talked about geoscientists coming into classrooms and giving public lectures. So we know that that type of outreach was happening at that time. Now, when we move into the 70s and 80s, this is getting more theoretical, and really this is based in science communication research. But there was a lot of work done on public perceptions, especially of nuclear. That was the big one, since it was obviously timely at that time. But really what they were seeing is strong negative perceptions, especially in the 70s and 80s towards uranium. And if anyone's interested, I attended a science communication conference lately in which Sonia Pemberton, who was involved in the making of this documentary called Uranium Twisting the Dragon's Tail. I don't think it's on Netflix. It's on one of those streaming channels, and it's really, really good. It tells the entire story and history of nuclear energy. And I learned a lot, and I'm a geoscientist, so would recommend that. And then moving on into more of the 90s and kind of the 2000s, there was a big report that came out by the GSA where basically they said that the public didn't have earth science knowledge, which is, again, it's something we all know, but that's where it was kind of, originally stated. And they had all these action items, which in my opinion are really great action items. Like they wanted to, tell other scientists about earth science. go into schools. Even adult education was proposed, workshops, policy engagement, things like that. But it's important to note that, even with these calls to action that big organizations like GSA had, there really wasn't a lot of support for geoscientists in how to actually do that. And really, in terms of supports, the only things that I could see was a 1959 report that talked about jargon and removing jargon from reports. And now, like, the only other thing, which hopefully everyone's familiar with, is Geologize, which is a geoscience specific communication course that only started being offered. I think it was, like 2 or 3 years ago. And then moving on to more current stuff. So getting into the later 2000s, now there's been a ton more information, or a ton more research being done on this stuff, and still practical perspectives, which are really great to see. So we know that there's still more teacher workshops happening, student workshops. A big advancement was UNESCO's global geoparks, which now there are tons of across the world, which was a great addition to see. But one of the key things in my mind is Ian Stewart's work. He's done a lot of stuff, and really he's looking at geoscience communication from a strong theoretical and research perspective, which was something that was missing for a very long time in my mind. And we'll kind of go into some of the tactics that he uses a bit later. So, in terms of what's the problem with what I just talked about, to me, what I figured was the problem with this is that geoscience communication practitioners don't seem to be aware of the science communication research. And the only reason I'm saying that is because when you look at all of the literature out there about these things, no science communication is referenced in these papers, again, except for Ian Stewart. So that made me think, well, that's a problem. And it's a problem because the science communication models and science communication theory, which I'll talk about in a bit, they've been used in really diverse contexts for various objectives. And really, they've been used in quite controversial contexts as well, which is especially useful for geoscientists when we think about all the challenges that we're currently facing, again, with perceptions of mining, decreased enrollment and things like that. More practically, this research can tell us useful findings about evaluation techniques, which is a big problem that I've heard from geoscience communication practitioners. So, what approaches they should be using and which ones they shouldn't, what formats are more suitable, things like that. And another key thing with this, in my mind, is we can emphasize that geoscience communication, it's an actual robust field, and it can have all this theoretical backing and literature to support it if we use what science communication already knows. But again, as I said, currently a lot of the literature doesn't base it in that theory. So if it wasn't already obvious, in my mind, the clear solution to geoscience communication's problem is science communication. And before we dive into the history of science communication, I always think it's important to mention that science communication has truly been happening for a very long time. And in fact, Plato is often considered as one of the first science communicators. So, again, just like geoscience communication, with science communication, I would define it as just the communication of science to non-specialists. And first of all, when I started my PhD and started reading this literature, I found it very challenging to basically understand what was going on. It was very jargon heavy, and there were all these different kind of trends of research that was happening, and it was very hard to situate myself and my research in that space, if that makes sense. So for me, the science communication models, which I'm going to talk about here, were something that basically brought all these things together in a way that I could understand them. And so that's why they're kind of the basis of my talk today. It's just the way I've understood things. So first of all, we have the deficit model. And really this model is based upon a notion that the audience is an empty vessel. They need information from scientists, so the scientists are going to give it to them. And some of the objectives of why practitioners or communicators do this would be like to educate, they want to inspire, they want to promote, they want to address. And then in terms of activities, that might be things like a science presentation, maybe an exhibit or a display at a museum, a promotional strategy, something like that. Then we move on to the dialogue model. And really this model promotes dialogue between scientists and publics. So there's much more of a two-way communication that happens. And some of the objectives with this might be to connect, to debate, to discover public opinions, things like that. And then with activities, this might be more of things like hands-on activities, or maybe you're training or developing certain skills or workshops, networking, things like that. And then we move on to the participatory model, where now science is kind of seen as one of multiple sources of knowledge in solving problems, along with many others. And it involves more people, I would say, in these interactions. So it's more of a multi-way communication approach. So the objectives with this would be to potentially to reflect, to co-create, to participate, to involve. And some of the activities might be to co-create or citizen science, things like that. Okay, so now with the deficit model, I'm going to try and go through the history of them. And I have times in the top right corner, but note that these are genuinely, they're not perfect. Every country in the world pretty much has a different science communication story. So this is much more representative of like a global North or even North America's broad history. So in my opinion, the deficit model was founded on this basis that society should support science and that it's a good thing that if society supports science. So broadly, there were kind of these two trends that I found. And it's again, the first trend is what it called science and technology policy. So this is one that's founded on the basis that in a democracy, people make political decisions, right? But the public voice can only be effective if citizens have the knowledge, and in this case, the scientific knowledge, in order to make those decisions. So if you have an ignorant public, then they're not qualified to take part in those decisions, is essentially what it comes down to. The second trend, which I call the knowledge context trend, really this originates from this desire to develop a scientific culture. So I like to think of it in terms of just like basic scientific literacy, where it's considered, again, to have a society that knows and understands science. So it primarily took the form of these science literacy initiatives and programs, which were intended to promote and propagate scientific information. And either way, it doesn't matter how this kind of model evolved. It was happening in the context of these very controversial events. So things like Fukushima, Chernobyl, the climate change debates, vaccine rollouts, evolution, all sorts of things along those lines. And so we'll talk about how the deficit model works, especially with those controversial things a little bit more later. So with each of the models, I'll first kind of talk about the theoretical components of the model, and then we'll look at those models from more of a critical lens and look to see the actual evidence behind those models. So again, the deficit model really, it kind of stemmed out of science popularization, which I talked about before, but basically where science is promoted in everyday media. In general, the public is considered to have intellectual deficiencies, which the scientist has that information, and then you have this one-way flow again from the scientist to the public. One big assumption with the deficit model is that more information is going to equal more positive attitudes. And we'll come back to that in the next slide. Another thing about the deficit model is that scientific knowledge is assumed to be more important and better than other forms of knowledge, like indigenous knowledge or something like that. And again, a reminder of some of the objectives that can be associated with this. So again, increasing science literacy, or if we're trying to eradicate superstitions, things like that. Okay, so now if we actually look at the evidence behind some of the things we just talked about, one of the big things is with that assumption that more information equals more positive attitudes, this has actually been largely disproven by a few different studies. So one of the examples I'll talk about is the Sputnik era, basically during the space race in the United States. This was apparently a golden age of scientific literacy, where you had this informed American public pushing for these large scale government projects and investments towards science and astronomy and things like that. And yet there's a lot of public opinion surveys that were done at that time that revealed that the public was barely even familiar with like basic science concepts, even though they were very much supportive of these science-based activities. So in one of these survey results, only 38% of people, and these were large scale surveys too, I don't have the exact number, but large surveys, only 38% people knew that the moon was smaller than the Earth, and only 4% could correctly indicate the distance in miles between the moon and the Earth. So again, really interesting that there was this kind of this disconnect at that time. Now, another example in support of that is the fact that that statement that, again, more information is more positive attitudes, it's not universally valid. So there's a study in this bottom left-hand corner here. Basically, these were knowledge and attitude surveys that were done in India and Europe. And so they took various Indian states, which are these dots on the left here, generally. And then I can't remember if it was European countries or regions, something like that. And those are on the right side here. And what they actually see is in the Indian states, as you move up in knowledge, so as they get more knowledgeable, they have more positive attitudes. But then when you go to Europe, basically with more knowledge, people actually get more skeptical of attitudes, or skeptical, and then thus their attitudes come down. So you kind of see that decoupling. So again, with the deficit model, we'll talk about it more later, but a lot of people think we should throw away deficit. It doesn't work for these reasons that I just talked about. But I like to challenge that, because clearly there is something about the deficit model that does still work. I always think of Bill Nye the Science Guy, which is a prime example of deficit model communication. He talked to us through our TVs about science. He wanted to give us scientific information. I don't know anyone who doesn't know Bill Nye the Science Guy and who doesn't love him and learn something from him, right? So I think we just have to think about how we communicate in different ways too. It can't all just be about the models. So now moving on to the dialogue model. Really, this model came about from findings that knowledge still wasn't increasing. There were still these negative attitudes, and there were still controversies that were happening around the globe. And then So with that, we see this shift from a more deliberative towards a more deliberative and inclusive form of science communication. Now, the shift from deficit to dialogue came from this greater understanding of the fact that people are the product of their surroundings, their upbringing, their religious views, their political views, the people that influence them, and like all these other factors, right? So the dialogue model recognizes this and then basically tries to find common ground where a more inclusive understanding can be established, is how I would put it. So again, this is theoretical. It's much more of a two-way conversation. Again, scientific knowledge is considered more equal now to other forms of knowledge, but often it still does only benefit the scientist. So now when we look at the evidence behind the dialogue model, one of the main supports for it is again in line with this idea that people are influenced by many factors in their lives. So in a Nisbet 2005 study, they found that certain value dispositions influence opinions on stem cell research. So as you can see highlighted in these red circles, there are positive correlations between higher education and income with greater support for stem cell research. We also see that religious ties, ideologies, and abortion positions are strongly negatively correlated with positive support for stem cell research, as in if you're conservative, religious, and oppose abortion, you'll strongly oppose stem cell research, and none of that should be surprising to us. And then also in a Besley and Mikoma study, they found an interesting finding that basically being perceived as a good listener, no, perceived doesn't necessarily mean you are a good listener, predicts that public's beliefs that authoritative decisions will be made legitimately, and they're going to have more positive feelings and attitudes just overall towards whoever is communicating the message. There's also a Gesteel study that found that when publics feel like their voices and opinions have been heard, they're more likely to vote in upcoming elections, which is a really powerful finding in my mind. Again, none of these should be super surprising findings, but science communication is very strategic. So even little findings like this, in my mind, can make a huge difference in how we approach our communication. Okay, so now moving on to the participatory model. So I kind of identified three trends where the participatory model evolved from. So one being decision-making. And to me, this represents the earlier history of the participatory model, where publics were basically included in making science policy decisions as well as guiding publicly funded research. Then there's another trend, which I'm calling the knowledge and innovation trend, which is a much more current trend, where basically publics are involved in knowledge and these innovation-making processes. Essentially, this is meant to make knowledge more openly accessible in an effort to address these difficult societal issues, basically. And then I also separated out citizen science. It's likely part of, honestly, both of these trends, but in the literature, there's just so much, like I'm talking like the last 2 years on citizen science. So that also seems to be another trend in the participatory model. So theoretically on the left, compared to the deficit and dialogue models, participatory model involves more compromising, negotiation, mutual satisfaction, and accommodation for diverse stakeholders and things like that. So it's, again, much more of a two-way conversation or, again, multi-way conversation type format. But the big key difference for me from the dialogue to participatory model is the change in the shift of power. Now it's equal power, even more so sometimes the power lies with the public. And it's about the public's needs, and the scientists are kind of just supporting them in that process. And now if we go to the right side for the actual evidence behind the participatory model, I don't have a ton here, and there's a reason for that. There's not a lot of research out there on that, especially in terms of on the evaluation side of things. And a part of that is just because the participatory model is so new, but in my opinion, that's a big gap. A lot of the evidence that is out there, it's solely based on practice, which is great to have that perspective, but it would also be nice to back that up with some strong quantitative data in my mind. So one practical example I have is from Wetter 2022, in which they basically did this participatory art-based intervention where they stacked and built these walls of waste that you can see in the photo there. And then basically students would get other students who were passing through the school and they would stop in and, you know, start talking and having conversations about this stuff. But it also locally started some really powerful conversations through social media about waste, which was quite interesting to see. But again, a lot more research and evaluation needs to be done there. With how I've described the participatory model so far, hopefully you might see some of the challenges with this, and these are often noted in the literature, that often they require a lot of money and a lot of time are two big things. Also, a lot of people say it only engages those who are already interested or care about whatever it is that they're talking about. So there's some issues with that. Also, scope would be another thing. It's hard with these projects to reach a lot of people, but there can be variations in that. So, yeah. So to kind of summarize what we've just talked about, the literature often describes the transition from deficit to participatory as this very straightforward thing that happened over just a couple of decades. In reality, that's not how it worked. As you can see, it was a very long and convoluted route. It's much more complex in reality. And often it's not necessarily stated, but it comes off in these papers that when you go from one model to the next, it kind of means that the previous model should be left behind and we should never use it again, which in my mind, it's not the case. And that deficit dialogue and participatory model should all kind of work together in practice. Also, there's local variations. There's a really interesting paper by Horst where she talks about Denmark's history and how they actually went the opposite direction. So they started more participatory in these things that were called folk high schools. Basically, these high schools were, I think they were called like a school for life or something like that, but they were open schools, anti-authority, and basically we're intending to prepare students for everyday practical life. So that was one aspect. And then they also had these things called consensus conferences, which also were used in the United States for a while as well. But basically when there was any societal problem, members of the community, politicians, scientists would all come together and talk and work these things out and come up with a solution. But now I won't get into it, but basically a bunch of things happened in the political space in that country, and now they've turned to just more deficit style science communication, which I thought was really interesting. Okay, so I only have a little bit of time left, so I'd like to finish up with some of these tactics. Now, these tactics, again, they're not often talked about in the literature, but there are some key authors out there. I'll show a few examples from John Besley, but he's done a lot of work in this area. And these tactics are super interesting to me, and they are what are basically guiding the rest of my PhD research, because I think they are really interesting ways that we can alternatively think about science communication. So, first, I'm going to talk about frames. So frames are basically approaches to communicating that highlight some aspect or look at a problem through a certain lens to influence how someone thinks about that thing. So there's tons of frames out there. One frame, again, that I'm thinking about including in my research is hopefully something you guys are familiar with, which I've called in my paper prescriptive mining frame. And it's this idea that just sometimes with how the mining industry communicates things, it sounds very, again, prescriptive, like you need mining. It's this very one-way frame of how they talk about mining, which I find very interesting. Anyways, I'm hoping to look into that, but I'm going to talk about a couple of frames here today. So one of them being a cross-partisan frame and the hope frame. So for the cross-partisan frame, basically this was a survey experiment that looked at public support for an energy law. And I believe this was done in the United States. Essentially what they did is they tried different political frames with a directed message surrounding this Energy Act. And then they evaluated how publics responded to it. So then one of the frames was what they called a cross-partisan frame, where essentially in the message that they created, they indicated that there is mixed party support for that act. So basically some Democrats and some Republicans are for it and some are against it, mixed opinions. And then what they actually found is that instead of interpreting the information through the lens of whatever their preferred party was, they completely disregarded that and then just simply looked at the facts of the message that came through. And to me, that's a really, really interesting finding that they found there. So then with the hope frame on the right, this is from the field of climate change communication. So in the top figure, basically you have constructive hope. Sorry, this is a little bit small, which is number 1 here. And this is positively related to response efficacy, but importantly in my mind, policy support and intentions to engage politically on the issue. So if a message about climate change is used or done using a hope frame, then there's a greater chance that the public will support policies around it and actually act on this issue. And then conversely, with false hope, which is number 2 along here, you can see that negatively correlates even more strongly for policy support and behavioral intentions. So false hope is not a good approach, not a good frame to use in this case. And then as shown in the bottom figure, there is a stronger positive relationship between the constructive hope and intentions to take political action on climate change for those who have higher constructive doubt than those who have less doubt. I know that's kind of confusing phrasing, but basically it's saying having hope that humans will reduce climate change with some degree of skepticism and recognition that humans aren't doing enough may actually be constructive and motivate political action. Hopefully that makes sense. So another tactic that we can potentially use is relatability. So which is just as it sounds, how relatable we come off to people. So in formal education research, relatability was first constructed by merging 2 understandings. So one being that self-perceptions predict motivation and performance. And 2, that interpersonal relationships also impact motivation. So a Furrer and Skinner study that is shown on the right here, basically what they found is that girls typically reported higher relatedness to peers, teachers, and adults, especially adults, and their emotional and behavioral engagement. And just to let you guys know, emotional and behavioral engagement are key prerequisites to learning, things like forming friendships and all of these like key developmental factors for kids. Those are huge prerequisites for it. So basically what they found is that relationships and the feeling of relatedness to these people influences how emotionally and behaviorally engaged they are. And then the final thing that I'll talk about is something called benevolence, which is basically how warm someone comes off. But again, just like the other things that we've talked about, this is this variable that studies have shown that if the scientist or the communicator is coming off more warm than someone who is not, this can significantly change how the audience thinks about that person, which to me is a really, really interesting and powerful thing that we probably often don't really think about. And that is all I have for today. Sorry, I didn't have time for concluding science. I don't really like them anyway, but yeah, thank you guys very much. Hopefully you learned something new today. I guess my big thing that I hope people take away from this is that geoscience communication can and should be backed by true science communication theory and literature. Thank you.